Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Maria Kanchan, Dean of the McCourt School of Public Policy.
Well, good afternoon. That's quite a welcome for a dean. Good evening. My name is Maria Kanchan, and I am the Dean of the McCourt School of Public Policy, and I am absolutely delighted to welcome you to the Georgetown Institute of Politics and Public Service and SiriusXM Town Hall with Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. In a conversation led by Mo Alathe, GU Politics founding executive director, and Julie Mason, host of Julie Mason Mornings on SiriusXM satellite radio, the secretary will discuss American transportation and infrastructure, including the hugely consequential implementation of the bipartisan infrastructure law. Now, infrastructure might not be as flashy as some other policy issues. Some of you might not think that policy is flashy overall. You would be wrong. But it's important to acknowledge that this bipartisan legislation makes a once-in-a-generation investment in American roads, bridges, transit, rail, ports, and airports. This bill also provides an opportunity to address important and long-standing inequities in our communities by expanding access to clean drinking water and ensuring that every American has access to high-speed internet. It also serves as a really important example of the essential work of government and the importance of common sense policymaking. I'm deeply grateful to Mo and his team for the work of GU Politics and for their efforts to engage diverse perspectives in the most pressing political and policy issues of our time, something that can be particularly difficult to do in a productive and respectful way in this partisan climate. I am pleased to welcome Christopher Wolf, a Master of Public Policy candidate at the McCourt School, who will give a more formal introduction of our speakers. Chris?
Thank you, Dean Kanchan, for that wonderful introduction. My name is Christopher Wolf, and I'm a second-year Master's in Public Policy student at the Georgetown McCourt School of Public Policy and a frequent participation in GU Politics events. It is an honor and a privilege to stand before some of my peers, professors, and fellow Georgetown students today. Sound transportation policy is vital to a nation's well-being. While in McCourt, I have researched public transportation policy and am currently writing a thesis on the intersection between quality of service and public transportation ridership levels. While working in transportation policy this past summer, I saw firsthand how comprehensive and reliable transportation infrastructure can boost economic growth and encourage community development. That being said, it is my honor to introduce today's speaker. Pete Buttigieg is currently serving as the 19th U.S. Secretary of Transportation. As Transportation Secretary, he played a key role in the development, passage, and implementation of the bipartisan infrastructure law, the most ambitious infrastructure investment in the nation's history, which the President signed into law last November. Secretary Buttigieg has also made history as the first openly gay person in a presidential cabinet. Before joining the administration, Secretary Buttigieg sought the Democratic nomination for president in 2019 and 2020. In 2011, at the age of 29, he was elected mayor of his hometown of South Bend, Indiana, where he served 2 terms and adopted the now nationally beloved nickname, Mayor Pete. He also served as an officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve for 7 years. In 2014, he took a leave of absence from the mayor's office to bravely serve this country overseas in Afghanistan. Today's discussion will be moderated by Mo Alathe, Executive Director of GU Politics, and Julie Mason, host of Julie Mason Mornings on SiriusXM's POTUS channel. Please join the conversation on social media by tagging @GU Politics and the official event hashtag #Pete@GU. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Mo Alathe, Julie Mason, and Secretary Pete Buttigieg.
Boy, it's Saxa, everyone. Look at this.
All right.
Oh, wow.
You know how to make a guy feel welcome. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, all of you, for coming today. It's really wonderful. And Secretary Pete, Great to have you as well. Really looking forward to the questions, which is always the best part. But Mo and I have just a few to start with. First, it looks like there might be another rail strike. What can you tell us about what's going on?
So what's going on is that the agreement that was reached in a few weeks ago is now being ratified by the members of the different rail unions. It's not just one company and one union or even one consortium and one set of unions. There's roughly a dozen unions that are involved. And there's a very natural process of back and forth that goes on right now. That's part of a cooling off period that extends into the next month. I think we're going to get to a good place, but the tentative agreements that were worked out now have to go to the members, and sometimes there has to be a little more revision before they can be finalized. Obviously, it's something we're following very closely because it's extremely important to make sure that everything continues smoothly on our rail networks. It's one of those many parts of our supply chains that you don't think about unless there's a problem, and if there's a problem, you can't think about anything else. So continue to see good indications of progress here, but it is something we're going to keep watching very tightly.
A lot of this conversation is going to focus on infrastructure and the infrastructure, the Jobs Act. But before we get to that, I have one other sort of current issue. We were talking backstage, I'm leaving here to go catch a flight to New York later tonight. Will my flight be on time? Right, what's going on with the airlines right now, and what's DOT doing about that? Yeah, mine maybe not.
Can't guarantee. No, so here's where we are. The airlines had a near-death experience during COVID, and then they received a lot of taxpayer support to keep them in business. And now demand has come roaring back. We're glad demand has come roaring back. That's a great thing. But the airlines need to be prepared to service the tickets that they sell. And far too many times this summer, they were not. And part of that has to do with letting a lot of staff go into early retirement. And they haven't had the crews that they need to service all of these flights. So we've had a lot of conversations with airline leadership about public expectations, about our expectations as a department. We've seen a lot of improvement. We've seen cancellation rates go back below about 2%. They're never going to be zero, because of weather and other issues. But we were seeing them as high as 3-4%. The difference between 2% and 4% doesn't sound like much, but that's the difference between things feeling basically normal and headlines using words like meltdown and chaos, because the system is pretty brittle. It's not designed to take much of a disruption right now. And that's what the airlines need to work through. We're working through some things on our side too, making sure air traffic control is properly staffed, other issues, but that's not what's been behind the majority of the delays. And while we've seen improvement, we're not out of the woods yet, and I think it's going to be more months before we can confidently say that the aviation system is as resilient as it needs to be.
You asked a lot of the airlines. How tough were they to deal with?
Look, we've all had that experience, right? Where you buy a ticket for maybe a lot of money to get to somewhere and you're expecting to get there. And if you don't get there, you're expecting to know what's going to happen next. So what we do as a department is several things. One thing is we enforce, you may not realize how many rights you already have as a passenger, and we enforce those. One basic one is if you get canceled, you're entitled to a refund. Well, what happens a lot of times is you'll call the airline and they'll say, oh, we're so sorry you're canceled, we'll give you 2,000 miles. That sounds good. That's worth about $25. And if you don't know that you have that right, that we will back you up on and enforce, you could miss out on some value. So we're enforcing the rules we have. We're raising the floor of the rules that are there. Because another issue is that it's just it's kind of a bare minimum right now in terms of what's required of airlines. So we right now are in the process of raising the bar on, for example, what counts as such a serious delay that the airline has to refund your money. But the thing we're finding is really working well is alongside of that, the enforcement and the rulemaking is just using the informal powers of the department. So it was one thing for me to convene, for example, after Memorial Day, we saw terrible delays and cancellations. Convened all the airline CEOs, said, we got a problem here. We've really, I need to know what you're doing to make sure we can get on time, and I'm happy to help. I woke up the next day, checked my phone, flight was canceled. So we've been going through this process, but the thing that had the most effect on the airlines was an incredibly simple thing, which my colleagues thought up at the department, which was we just took all of the different practices of the airlines and we created a simple tool to see them online. You can check it out. You just look up airline dashboard on our website. And it says, little green check marks, little red X's, what the different airlines will do if you get stuck, for example, and it's their fault. Will they rebook you on their plane? Will they rebook you on another airline? Will they get you a meal? Will they get you a hotel voucher? And it's not a complicated website, so it took us about a week or two. And I just sent a letter to the CEO saying, hey, we're going to put this website up in a couple weeks, so now would be a great time to, check on your customer service policies and improve them. In a few days, we went from 0 out of the top 10 airlines, for example, guaranteeing in writing that they'll give you a voucher for a hotel or a meal, to 9 out of the top 10. And so I'm continuing to look at what we can do both just by picking up the phone and with our official powers, and then with these other tools that turn out to be very powerful, all working together to get passengers a better experience, because the entire country needs a healthy aviation system and a better passenger experience than a lot of people had this summer.
And they got such a huge bailout, too. That's part of what makes it so frustrating for people, I think.
Yeah, over $50 billion in taxpayer funding went to keeping the airlines in business. And just for the record, that was a good thing. I would insist that that was a good thing, because we could have lost our aviation system. And one of the better days of that first period when we were fighting the impacts of COVID was when I saw flight attendants being told they could tear up their furlough notices because of this aid. But with that comes high public expectations, and the airlines need to level up.
So let's talk about the infrastructure law that passed. The dean said during the welcome, transportation and infrastructure aren't always the flashiest or sexiest topics.
But I think for all of us they are, right? We know,
like in this
we know
room,
just how exciting transportation is.
In this room, totally.
Yeah, all right, good. We're on the same page.
But tell us why it was such a big deal. Why should most people actually care about the passage of that law?
So it's literally building the future of this country. Not even every generation, every few generations gets to be on hand when we shape what the built environment of the country is going to look like. And this is one of those moments. That's why it's a big deal. The big deal. One thing I'm trying to get to catch on, so far it hasn't, but maybe you all can help me, is that I think, Teddy Roosevelt had the Square Deal. FDR had the New Deal. I think of this as the big deal. This plus all of the other things that the Biden-Harris administration has achieved, right? You can insert an adjective in between if you want to in honor of our president. But if you look at what's been done, with the Inflation Reduction Act, that's the biggest legislative action on climate in any country ever. You look at what it means to have the legislation that was advanced, even just to fight COVID, the American Rescue Plan, and what that means in communities across America. And then the centerpiece, of course, of what I get to work on every day, this infrastructure investment. It is colossal. It is the biggest investment in roads and highways since the interstate highway system was created. It's the most we've done for public transit in the history of the federal government. It's the most we've done for passenger rail since Amtrak was stood up 50 years ago. Now, just because it's big and a lot of money doesn't automatically mean that it's going to transform everybody's lives for the better in the ways we need it to. That's where execution, delivery, implementation comes in. And that's the mode we're in right now as a department and as an administration. But just think about what it means for there to be a safer, cleaner, faster way to get to where you need to be for people and for goods. And that's what we have a chance to deliver right now. So the best part of my job, or one of the best parts of my job, is going to community after community, talking to people about what these changes are going to mean to them, and hearing from them about how excited they are about anything from stuff that comes very naturally to anybody, even casually thinking about transportation, like Tucson, 22nd Street Bridge. It's like many bridges in the US, in rough shape. As a result, they've had to restrict the kinds of traffic that can use it. Basically, there's a weight limit to use that bridge. And what that means is no buses, no school buses, no trucks, no emergency vehicles, which means an ambulance has to go around the long way, or a school bus has to take a much longer route, and we're going to fix it. And because we're going to fix it, everybody's lives get just a little easier and a little safer. So from that to things that very few people think about in terms of transportation, like fish. We were in the Pacific Northwest last week in Washington State. There's a huge issue with the way that water runs under roads and highways, the culverts that are blocking the passage of salmon that have to swim upstream. Just wasn't something people were thinking about in a very long-term way when they built this stuff in the 50s and 60s. It's become a huge issue for the economy of that region and for tribal communities in that region that really depend on healthy fisheries. We're fixing that. There's $1 billion for that in the infrastructure package. So large and small, every kind of community, every form of transportation is getting improved. And that, to me, is as exciting as it gets in this job.
How about the politics of passing that bill? I know Republicans are accusing you of pursuing a radical agenda and woke politics in the implementation of infrastructure spending. Was it tough to get that done? What did it take?
Yeah, really radical to rebuild bridges, right, and fix roads.
It's woke.
I mean, yes, it was not immune to politics, but I think this is, or at least ought to be, one of the least political or the least partisan things in domestic politics. Now, in reality, it's never quite that way. But it's worth mentioning that quite a few Republicans crossed over in the Senate, and a handful did in the House, in order to work with Democrats and work with the president to get this done. And what I've noticed is whether someone voted for it or against it, they are perfectly happy to support the individual projects we're funding with it. So that's how you know it's good policy, is people who weren't even there for us when we were trying to get it done, then just first in line to help try to get some credit when it leads to an actual project in their district or in their state. Because, you know, it doesn't only benefit Democratic or Republican communities. It benefits everybody. Everybody's going to be better off. And I've always believed good policy is good politics. I think that's certainly true on something like this, that the entire country has known for decades that we needed to do, but hasn't always happened. In the last administration, I'll be honest, it's one of the few things where I would say the last president had me fooled. I really thought they were going to do a big infrastructure package, because why wouldn't you? He said he was going to do it. Okay, that's not necessarily a reason to expect something to happen. But also it just made a ton of sense. It was going to boost the economy. Everybody loved it, and they failed to get it done. But now we have it. We got it done. The president signed it, and it's all about just making sure we deliver $1 trillion worth of value, about half of which is in the transportation side, for all of that taxpayer money that's being entrusted to this project.
If we can stay on the politics of this for just another moment, and pretty soon I think we're going to start to take questions from the audience, the students, and as you know, being your 5th time here, their questions are always better than mine. But I do want to ask a little bit about the politics of this, because look, you know, I was a political hack for 20 years before I came back to Georgetown and working at this institute, and every week of those 20 years was supposed to be infrastructure week. Right? Like it was just it became the joke. But you know, there was a time when it was bipartisan, when infrastructure may have been the only bipartisan issue out there. And this time, not only did you have partisan bickering, but you had intra-party bickering to some extent. That delayed its passage. And so, you know, having been here so many times, you and I and our students have had this conversation so many times about the polarization. I guess my question is, like, how did you guys get it done this time? And how did the polarization around roads and bridges and infrastructure, what does that tell us about the state of our polarization in our politics today?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, having said that this should be beyond politics, obviously a lot of things that are ideologically contested are at stake in how we design our transportation. is climate change real and important to do something about? If you believe the answer is yes, that has big implications for how you organize transportation, because transportation is the single biggest part of our economy contributing to climate change. Do you believe, as the president does and as I do, that supporting organized labor and standing with labor unions is an important part of what it means to make good on a commitment to a strong middle class? If you believe the answer is yes, that has a lot to do with how you shape your transportation policy. Do you believe it's clear that the ways in which investment was either denied to historically excluded communities, especially black, brown, and tribal communities, or designed in a way that harmed them? Do you believe that creates some obligation to do better this time? If you believe the answer is yes, as we do, then that has implications. So I don't mean to blow past the fact that a lot of contested things are at stake here. But I also think when you get those things right, everybody's better off. And I think that's how we got this done. So what does it tell you about our politics? Look, it turns out literally everything can be politicized right now. I mean, you could say the same thing about vaccines, right? 10 or 20 years ago, I think the idea that there would be a measurable partisan divide over whether somebody would seek inoculation against a rampaging deadly disease would have seemed really silly. Now it's a basic fact of life. So a lot of things that shouldn't be swallowed up in that get that way. And yet, I would also like to believe that the fact that we got this done shows that you can get through that sometimes. And remember, this is part of our president's theory of change, for which he was in some circles mocked when he prepared to take office. The idea that you could get Republicans and Democrats to do anything together was characterized as naive. And I think what you have in this administration is leadership that is very clear-eyed about the stakes and about partisan differences and about extremism that has in some cases even become a threat to our democracy itself. And on the other hand, refuses to take as a given the idea that a partisan or a political difference is insurmountable on all issues that we care about. And transportation has proved to be one of those issues, that even across some complicated differences and some jostling over priorities, we're able to get some pretty big stuff done.
I'm curious about the climate part of the infrastructure bill. So often in Washington, we talk about addressing climate and fixing the climate. But it seems to me that climate can also be a real complicating factor. The Mississippi River right now is at the lowest water level it's been since anyone has measured water, which is barges can't traverse the waterway, which interrupts supply chain. Right. So does our climate problem in this country make it more expensive to spend on infrastructure?
Unquestionably, yeah. Two things are true about the relationship of transportation and climate change. One is what I just mentioned, which is transportation is the sector emitting the most greenhouse gases. And so if we care about climate change, we have to make transportation part of the solution, and we are, by mode shifting trips to less climate or carbon intensive ways to get around, like giving people better options for public transit. Reducing the emissions impact of the trips we do take, like making sure everybody can afford and use EVs, and so on. But the other part of the relationship of transportation to climate change is transportation is harder because of climate change, right? One of the things that climate change damages is transportation. And that's true whether you have heat waves in the Pacific Northwest that are supposed to be statistically almost impossible, and instead they happen, and they have to shut down public transit in Oregon because the cables are at risk of literally melting.
The roads were buckling at one point, yeah.
Or whether we're talking about more and more frequent floods or extreme storms hitting. I was in Colorado, I-70, where you had a kind of a 1-2 punch where there was a drought followed by extreme floods. It was a wildfire, drought, then a wildfire, then a flood, which meant that there was a mudslide that just took I-70 out. And if you've been through that canyon, there's not a lot of other places to go, and it took days to get it back online, and heroic work by the Colorado DOT and the local engineers. So my point is we not only have to do the right thing in transportation to make it part of the solution, we have to invest in making our transportation systems more resilient to climate impacts that are coming no matter what we do. Not even coming, they're here. And we're doing just that. And again, I've seen elected officials from the other side of the aisle who don't like to bring themselves to use the word climate, but they will be there for funding for resilience in their communities because they know, and their constituents know, and frankly demand that something needs to be done to protect our infrastructure for the future.
All right. I know Julie and I have a bunch more questions that we'd want to ask, but let's start going to the audience questions. There's a standing mic in the center aisle. Start lining up.
Ooh.
We're going to start. Whoa. Wow, look at that.
Oh, a mosh pit forms.
You were right. This is a room that finds
Yeah.
this sexy.
Yeah. All right.
You folks here get it.
All right. Let's try to do this quietly.
I'm going to have to have some
When I
concise
point
answers
at
here.
you,
All right.
tell us your name, where you're from, what you're studying, your major or your school, and then ask your question in the form of a question, please. All right? And let's go to the audience.
Hi, my name is Felix Rice. I am a first year in the college, and I'm from metropolitan Dallas, Texas.
Great.
And I'm studying a lot of things right now, maybe government, we'll see.
Hope so.
But one of the things I do when I'm at home a lot is I ride the DART train from the suburb I live in downtown to Dallas. But one thing I've noticed when I'm on it is there's not a whole lot of other people on it.
Yeah.
Whereas I-35 is just packed, and we get wrecks there all the time. So even though we have all this great public transportation that people can take, how do we ensure that we actually encourage people to take advantage of that?
Great question. It sounds like you should talk to Chris about his thesis, too, the relationship of the experience to ridership. And I had a good look at the DART when I was in Dallas earlier last summer, and they're doing really good work there. So several things I think are important. First of all, let's start out with just the fact that the more people choose to use transit, the better. That's better for them, hopefully, if they're having a good experience and able to get to where they need to be. It's better for the climate because it's just a much more efficient way for people to get around. It may even be better for the development of a city, and I'm especially excited about lower density cities in places like Texas and what they can do to demonstrate transit can work. And the thing that I think is really important to emphasize when we're trying to build support for transit in places where it's not kind of culturally accepted is it's even good for the people who don't use it because it means that there are fewer cars on the road congesting the roadways that the drivers are using. So there's so many reasons that we're better off when more people use the transit systems that are there. But for that to happen, we have to make sure that it's a great experience. That includes both just the qualitative look and feel. Includes making sure that it actually meets people where the needs are. And a lot of things besides optimal design come into play when you're in the exquisitely politicized process locally of designing where transit ought to go. Just think about the fact that Washington, D.C., served by one of the great subway systems in the world, doesn't have a subway that goes to Georgetown, right? And there's some really specific reasons why that happens. And then, even over and above just the practicalities of it, and to that I would also add affordability. So a buck or two for transit fare doesn't sound like much to some people, but it can be a big issue. And it's very interesting to see some cities experimenting with zero fare transit and sometimes actually coming out ahead in terms of the benefits of it. And that's something we're watching very closely and seeing how we can be a constructive partner in those efforts. But there is also a bit of a cultural thing where we just need to, I think this exists in a few places like Manhattan that's just very used to this. But the idea that transit is not just for people who have no other choice. Transit should be a means of choice to get to where you need to be, even if you have a car. And that is as much about, I think, our mentality as it is about the nuts and bolts of how the system works. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. All right.
Thank you for being here, Mr. Secretary. Secretary Pete, okay?
That's fine. Or just Pete. Pete works.
My name's Chris. I'm a sophomore in the college studying government, and I'm from Rhode Island. And my question is, there was a lot of money in the Infrastructure Bill and the Inflation Reduction Act for a network of charging for electric vehicles and tax credits for purchasing vehicles, but still these vehicles are way too out of the price range for average middle-class Americans. So my question is, what will it take to bring those prices down, and how far in the future do you think that could become likely?
Yeah, so this is incredibly important because actually the more pressed you are in terms of your income, the more you theoretically could benefit from having an EV and saving the gas bills, but only if you can afford it in the first place. And the key moment we're looking for economically is when do the cars hit a level of parity with the equivalent gas model, or at least get close enough, and we're actually getting close on some models, where if your car payment's a little higher, because the sticker price is higher on an EV, you still come out ahead because your cost of fueling it is still lower, right? So if you think of there being kind of a baseline, let's say it's this much higher because EVs are just more expensive. And it's also a little further high in the up direction in terms of that delta, right? Because your electricity bill goes up, right? Because you got to charge the thing. But then you come out lower in terms of your monthly costs because you're paying less for gas, and maintenance starts coming into play because they have fewer moving parts and they're cheaper to maintain. What will it take to get there? Well, first of all, this is one of the reasons why we are so big on making sure that there are tax credits to make them more affordable. And importantly, in the Inflation Reduction Act, this includes on used vehicles. So Chasten and I got into EVs with a used car. It was $14,000 or $15,000. It's a used C-Max plug-in hybrid electric car that we got a few years ago in South Bend, plugged it in our garage, and saved us a lot of money on gas. So it was important to make sure that the used cars are part of that too. Now, ironically, some of these same elected officials who are hostile to EVs, citing as their number one piece of evidence that they're terrible, that they're expensive, they're too expensive, and I agree they're too expensive, voted against making it cheaper. So it raises the question of whether something else might be on their mind when it comes to their hostility to EVs. But the point is not just to use the subsidy to make the EV more affordable in the near term, although that is important. It's that the more we can accelerate the production of EVs, especially in the US, because this administration cares a lot about creating jobs for American workers. And I care a lot about that coming from an old auto town. South Bend, Indiana used to be the hometown of Studebaker. The more we do that, the more we get those kind of economies of scale where the underlying costs actually start to go down and it becomes naturally cheaper. Now, you might ask, why use taxpayer money to make that happen if that's the destiny of the automotive industry anyway, as we believe it is? And the answer is, yes, EVs are almost certainly where cars are going to go with or without us. But three things are not certain. Will it happen quickly enough to help us fight climate change like we need it to? Will it happen in a made in America kind of way? And to your question, will it happen in an equitable fashion so people who could really benefit from it the most can actually afford to get in on it? Those things don't necessarily happen on their own. That's why policy is needed, and that's what we're doing through the Inflation Reduction Act.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. All right, next.
Secretary Pete, thank you so much for being here. My name's Ayush. I'm a first-year student in the college studying government. And my question relates to sort of the safety aspect of the bipartisan infrastructure law. You know, safety and road safety has been one of the priorities of both the department and the law. So my question pertains to these self-driving autonomous vehicles and ships. So what is the department's outlook on safety, sustainability, and implementation of self-driving vehicles, partially self-driving vehicles, whether cars on the road, buses, public transport, or even in the shipping sector?
Great question. I'll come to the AV part in a minute, but first I just want to talk about safety, because we need to stop and think about this as a country. I bet most of us, even the youngest ones in the room, can picture at least one person in our lives who was killed in a car crash. Think about what that means. That every one of us can think of more than one person, probably. I mean, I can think just my high school years alone, the kid who sat next to me in study hall freshman year, and the kid who sat in front of me senior year in Spanish class. It is as if we grew up in a country in the middle of a war. 40,000 people die every year on our roads. Think about that. That's nuts. Or to put it another way, when you get on that plane later today, you will be in the safest mode of travel in the US. It is safer to have millions of people shot through the air nearly at the speed of sound in an aluminum tube 6 miles above the surface of the earth and then brought safely down. We've had 0 jetliner crash fatalities a year for several years running. And you can knock on wood, but it's not luck, right? It's the FAA. It's really careful policy choices, some of which are extremely conservative about safety, but which pay that dividend of it being extremely rare for somebody to be killed on an airliner. And yet, walking across the street, or if you're in an Uber to downtown or to 930 Club or wherever you kids go these days, You are less safe than Mo will be on his airplane tonight. That is not acceptable. And so we got to change that. So how do we change that? Safer roads, safer speeds, safer drivers, safer vehicles, and a better standard of care for when there is a crash, emergency services. And that's our strategy. Which brings me to your actual question. Sorry, I just wanted to level set on that because it's so important. So I have very high hopes for the theoretical possibility that self-driving cars and high-tech cars will save thousands and thousands and thousands of lives because human beings have a basically murderous track record as drivers of cars. But we're not there yet. And one thing that I'm extremely concerned about is the confusion of advanced driver assistance systems, as they're called, ADAS, with being some kind of driver replacement system. Because you hear these words thrown around, right, about these different features. Just, I want to be super clear. There is no car on the road today that you can go buy at a dealer that does not require you to be paying attention as a driver at all times. And a lot of people don't treat their advanced cars that way. And that's a real problem. I was just at the Detroit Auto Show. They're doing incredible stuff. I was there with the president looking at the technology, but I couldn't help but notice that a lot of the technologies that are being developed right now, especially around so-called level 2 systems, which are the ones that are pretty impressive. They can nudge you back into your lane if you're out of your lane. They can hit the brakes if you're too close to the car in front of you. Basically extremely sophisticated cruise control, right? A lot of the latest technology they're working on is technology to scan your eyes, for example. You ever been in one of these cars that flashes a little picture of a coffee cup if you haven't been paying attention? Or even turns off the cruise control if you're relying on it too much, like if it notices that your eyes aren't on the road. Think about that. We have had to develop technology to protect the driver from depending too much on the technology. So it tells you that there's a very messy transition between where we are now and where we could theoretically get to some years out. And of course, there are two especially confounding variables for this incredibly intelligent software that's going into the cars. One is snow, and the other one is human beings. And they're pretty close to figuring out snow. But sharing the road with human beings makes it incredibly complicated. And that's why we, as a regulator, one of the basic jobs of my department is to keep these things safe. Really need to be closely watching this. And not to geek out, we can geek out. As a matter of regulatory design, we have a gap here, or at least a source of confusion. And it's this. Historically, the division of labor is we, the federal government, regulate the car. Right? We have the crash test dummies. We set up the standards for the airbags. We tell you where the mirror ought to go. We do the car. And the state, the BMV, where you go get your driver's license, right? The state regulates the driver. So we don't have a system to handle what to do when the car is the driver. And we got some work to do on that. Actually, right now, there's nothing in our federal standards that says that the car has to have a driver in it. On the contrary, our standards prescribe exactly where the rear view mirror ought to be in a driverless car. So we need to update the policy to keep up with the technology. We also need to watch the technology because it's not there yet, and it's proving to be very dangerous when humans depend on it for too much right now. In the long run, extremely excited about the potential. And same with shipping too. We didn't get into that as much, but if we can solve it for passenger cars, we can definitely solve it for shipping. It's a great question. Thanks.
Thanks for the question. All right.
Hi, Secretary Buttigieg. My name is Pratik. I'm a sophomore studying government and computer science from Gloucester County in New Jersey. You've talked a lot about how transportation is intrinsically tied to the meaning of life.
Yes, thank you for noticing that.
I know a lot of Americans also get a deep sense of meaning from religion, and actually one of the first things that intrigued you to me was about how you were the first Democratic candidate that I'd ever heard talk about how your religion pointed you towards progressive policy in fields like transportation and elsewhere. I was wondering how recently I've been struggling with my faith, and so I was wondering how your faith impacts you in your daily life as transportation secretary and any similar experiences you might have had and what eventually brought you back.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for opening up about that. struggling with faith is it's a natural thing for any human to do. It's an especially natural thing to do when you're a student, when your full-time job is to figure out as much as you can about yourself and the world around you and the universe. And so coming to terms with that, it's definitely how I spend a lot of my time as a student. Not that that ever ends, but it's especially intense right now. And I guess if I had more time, I could probably think of some clever things about specific relationships between transportation and travel and faith. I mean, and I don't mean to be flip about it. Think how much scripture and sacred writing in any tradition has to do with journeys, pilgrimages, right? It's Sukkot right now, New Testament's full of, and the Old Testament full of highways. Every Eastern religious tradition I've ever been exposed to says a lot about movement. Because I think there is something that unlocks parts of us that are spiritually sensitive when we are put into that condition of movement versus the condition of rest. But I don't have anything really profound to say about that, so I'll just mention it. In terms of anything that might be more useful, I guess what I would say is that we often, I think, can find in our relationship with God, for those of us who feel a strong or important relationship with God to be part of our lives, in that a source of concern and solidarity with other human beings that cuts across any of the categories that are imposed on us by being in this world. Many of those categories, which of course also have a lot of political freight. Gender, sexuality, race, age, just to name a few. And part of what I get from my faith is a reminder that any human being is equal in the eyes of God. And even though that sounds like a very basic thing to say, we sometimes need to find ways and structures and means of connecting ourselves or recommitting ourselves to act in a way that reflects that that's actually true. And that's definitely something policymakers should do, even though it's also, of course, true that policymakers must serve people of every faith and of no faith equally. But more importantly, I think as human beings, it's something that we need to do. And wherever your particular journey with faith takes you, I hope that you can always find some kind of source of connection to everyone and everything that makes it possible for you to zoom out from these increasingly insidious distinctions that are created between us and other souls in order to be a better human. I guess that's the best thing I can say about it without some kind of tortured attempt to connect it back to the bipartisan infrastructure law. But thanks for asking that.
Thanks for the question.
Hi, my name is Anisa Nanavati. I'm a freshman at the School of Foreign Service, and my question is, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act has been championed as a major win for climate action. How will this act address issues such as environmental justice and racism and the systems of oppression that have existed in our country for years and years?
Well, thanks for that. I do believe we have an enormous, once-in-a-century kind of chance to make this country a fairer and better place through the choices that we're about to make on infrastructure. We begin with the fact that it's just plainly true that so many of the worst impacts of environmental injustice have been visited upon those who have been systematically and repeatedly excluded. So if we can improve the environmental impact of the way we move people and goods, you can almost expect, as a matter of course, that will benefit those who are overburdened and underserved right now. But that's only the beginning. What really excites me is a chance to affirmatively empower people who have been left out in the past. First of all, just the work to be done. It's the official name of the infrastructure law is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And those jobs, those good-paying jobs, many of which are good-paying jobs that lead to good-paying careers that are available to people whether you got a college degree or not, are jobs that have historically not been open to workers of color, and especially to women. We can change that if we're intentional about it. And we're working with the building trades, we're working with the states, we're working with transit agencies to try to make sure that those pathways are open. Same thing in terms of the small businesses that can get a chance to do some of that work. So there's a level of economic empowerment that's possible. There's also needing to pay attention to what it actually means in terms of public health when we have better transportation policy. For example, the people who tend to live around ports are often disproportionately poor and or people of color. And it's also true that you can measure the impact on, of the pollution generated by ports on things like rates of childhood asthma. So when we talk about electrifying ports, it's not just to have a nice view of the snow-capped peaks around San Pedro Bay. It's to make sure that the people who live nearest to the ports are not finding their lives are shortened because of what goes on there in a way that can't be separated from the ways in which they or their families might not have had many other choices about where to live for reasons that can't be separated from racial exclusion. All of this stuff is connected. It's also why I'm really proud that we're investing in reconnecting communities that were divided in the past. I can go to any community in the country and just mention in the abstract that highway or that interchange or that railroad that has served to separate or to segregate. I mean, the very fact that American English contains the phrase wrong side of the tracks tells you something, right, about the relationship between racial and economic exclusion and where our infrastructure sits. And wherever I go and I mention this, people nod. You can see that they're visualizing the example of this in their neighborhood or their community. So for the first time, this law contains resources to directly do something about it. And we can do it in other ways too. We just, in Detroit, we celebrated funding going from our department to help take I-375, which cuts like a gash through Detroit. And its construction destroyed a neighborhood called Black Bottom. And elevated, turn it into a boulevard that's going to add value. And one of the best things about this is while it is certainly empowering and restorative for largely black and brown communities that were harmed in the past, it makes no one worse off. Which is one of the reasons why it's been amazing to see the blowback on some of these policies we've had trying to make it better off. Some people are oddly triggered by policies that are going to make everyone better off. And I'm excited about that. And we also feel that as a weight and an obligation as we undertake this work, because it won't happen without intention. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Hello, Mr. Secretary. My name is Michael Wosch. I'm a first year in the School of Foreign Service from the suburbs of Detroit, Michigan.
There we go.
Yes, and I've heard you're quite a fan of Traverse City, Michigan, as am I.
It's great up there, isn't it?
Yes, it is quite beautiful. But my question tonight is, as in your almost 2 years experience in Washington, my almost 2-month experience in Washington, you've touched on trying to build bridges, both literally and figuratively, as the Secretary of Transportation. But after coming to Washington, my question is, how did you stay true to your Rust Belt values that shaped you? And is there anything that gives you hope as you attempt to cross the aisle in your work as Secretary of Transportation?
Well, thanks for that. We should compare notes on how Washington treats each of us as we go, us Midwesterners here. I think you may have experienced this. I grew up feeling a little bit in tension with my surroundings, and it was only when I left them, also to go to the East Coast for college, actually, that I began to feel the reverse, that I began to identify with them a little more militantly. Especially the first time that a college acquaintance repeatedly failed to remember whether I was from Indiana or Idaho, because they were all the same to her. And I would like to think there's a Midwestern ethos about seeing and treating people a certain way, and definitely a Rust Belt mentality about understanding the biggest thing that I think suits you to navigate Washington if you're from the so-called Rust Belt is that you grow up surrounded by large physical reminders of the impact of policy on your community. It could be I-375 if you lived in Black Bottom or Paradise Valley. In my case, it was an 800,000 square foot, 6-story, empty brick building that was the Studebaker assembly plant with broken windows that just loomed over our city like a ghost, so that even though I was born 20 years after the last car rolled off the line there, I could feel what that meant to our city that it had left. and over time began to understand that this had a relationship to decisions that were made in the big white buildings here in Washington, D.C. And the biggest thing that I think anyone who is involved in public policy or decision-making in general, private sector, public sector, whatever, as you find yourself invited to higher and higher tables, is to never forget the extremely immediate, concrete, physical, in-your-face, and sometimes very intimate impact that policy choices, even the unflashy ones, especially the unflashy ones, have on everyday life. And if you can hold on to that through all your studies and all the sophisticated things you're reading about here at Georgetown and whatever great career you go into, then you'll be doing all right.
I think we have time for one more question, Mr. Secretary.
Try to be concise.
Mr. Secretary, my name is Carter Weinstein. I'm also from Dallas, Texas. I'm in the McDonough School of Business here at Georgetown, and I'm probably going to end up studying finance like everybody else here. More of a general question for you. So more Americans than ever are concerned about the future of our country. Who is going to represent it in the impact of unstable international relations? To young voters, many of us voting for the first time, what is your view on the outcome of the next primary and presidential election, and do you foresee yourself having a hand in it?
So, I pride myself on directly answering questions. However, only because I'm here as a cabinet member, there are some restrictions on me venturing off into saying anything about campaigns and elections. So I'll only answer the first part of your question. Other than to say that I have no idea if I'll ever run for office again or not. And I'm not just saying that because it's the thing you're supposed to say. It's because I don't know. But what I do know is you're right that there's a lot to be worried about, and that not just every political outcome, but every policy outcome bears on the course of this country at an incredibly tender moment. As things in the last decade started to unfold the way that they did, a friend of mine commented that maybe this was a sort of a karma for my generation ever telling our parents that we were jealous of them for being around in the 60s, which is easy to romanticize in hindsight, but was really difficult and painful for most of the people who lived through it. And I think the years we're living through are kind of like that. If they go well, or even if they don't, they will probably be remembered as fascinating and flashy, and movies and books will be written about what happened in the late teens and early 20s. But living in it is hard if you care about the future of this country, because the future of this country is so uncertain. Certain things that we took as a given, especially a commitment to our democracy, really basic things, like when you get beaten in an election, you accept that you lost, which, by the way, sucks. I've been there, but that's what you do, because it's a democracy. Don't get started on it's technically a Democratic Republican, not a direct. We all know that. We all know that, but the most important thing about America is its democratic character, and that is on the line in a way that we haven't seen in our lifetimes. And that's frightening. And again, I'm parsing my words in a way I don't love to, only because there are specific penalties for venturing into campaign talk when I'm in this capacity. But on the policy side, I think one really important thing about the work we're doing, even if you're not an infrastructure geek like me and you don't care about fish culverts or bridge design, is that we've got to deliver. We've got to deliver results that people can feel are making their lives better. Not only because it's why we're all out here, it's what policy and politics and government is supposed to do, but also because whether we can do that or not is going to be maybe the biggest driver of whether we have enough public trust to stay a democracy, imperfect though it is. Those are colossal stakes, not even just for America, but in my view for humankind, because we're the most consequential democracy on earth. I And it strikes me that if you're roughly the age of a college undergraduate today, up until last year, in my view, you have witnessed mostly policy failure. Other than the Affordable Care Act, maybe a couple other high points, you have mostly watched our democratic system, our constitutional system, whatever you want to call it, not deliver for you. And we're in the business of changing that. Not just with the things that lend themselves to the high-minded rhetoric and glamorous, glorious moments and big bill signings, but just in the blocking and tackling of delivering good government, which hopefully a lot of you wind up deciding you want to be part of professionally, and we'll be hiring. And if we can get that right, we'll have a lot to be proud of about what we did in the 2020s that will reverberate much beyond even the life of the physical infrastructure that I'm so proud to be working on. If we don't, I shudder to think what could happen to our country and to humanity. So, no pressure, but that's what all of us in government feel right now, and I hope all of you who may or may not feel very empowered when it comes to the decisions that your government makes, but who are very empowered in terms of the moral authority that the voices of young people carry in public decisions. I hope you feel that too, because having been alive and around and engaged and in a position as exciting and full of opportunity as being students at a place like Georgetown means that it really will matter what you all decide to do and what you think. And I remain very optimistic about where that's going to get us. Thanks for the question.
Thanks. All right. Nobody go anywhere. We're going to do 2 goodbyes because Julie's got to do the formal radio goodbye. But I just want to say, Mr. Secretary, thank you. This is your 5th time here at GU Politics, making you the inaugural member of the Five Timers Club.
Yeah, all right.
We do
Is
not
there a jacket,
have a jacket,
or...
but you can totally take the mug.
I'll get the mug. All right,
Yeah,
I'll take it.
but in fairness, everybody gets it. But you can still take it.
Can I have
and I
5
want
mugs?
to thank all of you for being here. It didn't occur to me until just a couple days ago. Hoosier Month at GU Politics continues next week. Please join us in this very space on Wednesday night as we have a conversation with former Vice President Mike Pence about the future of the conservative movement. Okay.
All right. Pete Buttigieg, the 19th Secretary of Transportation. Thank you so much for joining us. Really, really terrific to get your thoughts. Thank you to the Georgetown students with us. Thank you to Julia Newton and the entire GU Politics team. I'm Julie Mason, along with Mo Alethi. This has been a SiriusXM and GU Politics Town Hall. Thanks to Megan Lieberman, Dave Gorab, Liz Aiello, Catherine Caperton, Patrick Faris, and the entire SiriusXM team here today. This is POTUS SiriusXM 124. Thanks, guys.
All right, thank you.